Okay, so this all started when my ex-wife and I had been married for around 18 months. Or rather, I started noticing things way earlier, but it reached its peak in the summer of 2007. About 2 months after we got married, she started going through some serious personal problems. Random mood swings, intense anxiety and irritability, that sort of thing. But we were working opposite schedules at the time, both working our butts off to save money for a housing deposit, so it's not like it wasn't a high-pressure time for us. I figured that as our living situation improved, so would her mental health. But as time went on, her anxiety just got worse and worse, until she became so dangerously paranoid that she basically couldn't work anymore. And it was agonizing to watch. It got so bad that she wouldn't even leave the house most days, and the worse she got, the more expensive her care was, which obviously put a lot of pressure on us financially as we were relying solely on my income alone. We were only in our mid-20s, but we were living like a couple in their 50s, me working 6 days a week while saving almost every penny for her meds. Things got even worse when I was basically forced to choose between taking care of her, going to work, or carrying on at college. That resulted in us moving in with her mom and me becoming her live-in nurse with nothing but my student loans and her mom's charity to sustain us. It was there that my ex went through a major depressive episode, working up to an attempt to take her own life that was horrifyingly close to being a success. After that, the doctors decided to jack up the dosage of her meds, which amounted to yet another financial strain that we just couldn't afford. Even worse, the increased amount turned her into a total zombie. Then, when we asked for an alternative, they gave her a kind of medication that made her really irritable and, I can't believe I'm saying this, violent. My ex suffered horribly, but she was never a violent person, and seeing her exhibit such rage from a few chemicals was just beyond disturbing to see. We got into a terrible kind of routine where I could only really sleep when she was asleep, which was sometimes hardly ever. One time we got into quite a regular schedule for a few days, going to bed just after 12, then getting up at 8. It was a solid little run, and she seemed a lot better during that time, but I think it just meant I let my guard down, and that nearly ended in catastrophe. I was always a pretty light sleeper, I think because just of the general anxiety that I had, so even the slightest peep and I'd be up like a light. But sometimes when I had a heavy load of schoolwork, I'd be up for like 20 plus hours and then go comatose for like 10. So this one time, I wake up and I can tell straight away that I'm alone in our bed. Only I can also tell that I'm not alone in our bedroom. There's someone stood at the end of our bed, standing perfectly still. It was a relief to see it was just my wife, but then I saw the knife in her hand, and I swear to God, I felt a chill go through me. We'd been locking up the sharp stuff for a while, so I had no idea how she got her hands on the knife. And as she's holding it, she's just mumbling quietly to herself. I remember straining my ears in an effort to work out what she was saying, and Jesus, I can barely describe the feeling when I realized she was arguing with herself about the pros and cons of murdering me versus leaving me alive. It was all broken, mostly nonsensical stuff, but it was basically along the lines of, he stops me from doing what I want, hurting people, and ending it. But there's no one else I can talk to. I need him. He needs me. You can probably imagine how that made me feel, hearing the person I love most in the world debating whether or not I deserve to live. I just remember rolling over her real slow and addressing her really softly by her pet name. Bunny, you don't have to do this. I then filled every single second of the next minute or so with chatter, listing all the reasons why she shouldn't do it. She'd go to prison. Everyone would be heartbroken. We'd never get to have kids. Everything we'd worked for would be gone. I'd be gone. When I finally ran out of things to say, there was this brief moment of silence, and I honestly thought the last thing I'd ever see was my wife diving on top of me with that blade shining in the dark. But after a moment, she just crawled back into bed, put the knife under her pillow, then laid there until she fell asleep. I just sat there, shaking and trying not to lose it, all until I finally heard that deep breathing that tells you someone's asleep. Then I really carefully took the knife out from under her pillow, went downstairs, then locked it inside the lockbox we kept in one of the cabinets. After that, I let out a whole lot of emotion, as quietly as possible, even drank a little to try to calm my nerves. When I was done, I crawled back into bed, wrapped my arms around her, then fell asleep. The next morning, when we woke up, she had absolutely no recollection of the event. She told me I must have had a nightmare, and that she'd slept like a log the whole night through. There was this horrible half-asleep moment when I thought she might have been right. One quickly expelled when I realized I could still taste the vodka in my mouth. Needless to say, we're not together anymore. Not directly because of her condition, but because she just wasn't happy being with someone anymore. It was heartbreaking, but I signed the papers. Last thing I ever want to do is be a burden to her. We keep in touch every so often, and I've never tried to remind her of that night. But part of me thinks she still wouldn't remember, that it was just some horrible side effect of her medication, and she'd never have done something like that otherwise. But still, it had me shaken up for a while. But can you blame me? The last person in the world I'd ever expected to almost killed me in our marriage bed. For the past year, I've been working as a front desk agent and lead night auditor for a pretty nice 2-star hotel. The owner, my former boss, has put a lot of time and energy into making the hotel seem better than it actually is. Because of the niceness of the hotel and generally low rates, we would get a lot of construction crews staying there. Their bosses were paying for 6 or 7 rooms at a time at a cheap flat rate, thanks to my boss helping them out. On one of these instances, we had some electricians staying. They were working for a rather famous southern grocery store that I won't name for the sake of anonymity. I was the one who had originally checked them all in with their boss and helped seal the deal to have our hotel be the one they continued to stay at through the length of their job. One of these men took a rather large liking to my coworker. She got a lot of attention from our guests because she was extremely nice and rather flirtatious without meaning to be. The worker was nice. He was the more level-headed one of his coworkers. While I had to get on his colleagues for yelling and carrying on outside at all hours of the night, he would often be the one helping me keep them quiet. He and my coworker, Jay, began dating, for a lack of a better word. She couldn't really date as she was in a program that helped people reform into normal life after drug use. She was picked up and dropped off by the facility, so there really wasn't much they could do in terms of dating, but she definitely grew infatuated with the man. She would talk about him at any chance the moment I clocked in. I was happy for her, glad she had found someone in light of all the stuff she'd been through. He would bring her and the housekeepers food during their shifts, tipped them well, and was the nicest man that we had dealt with all summer. One day, my other coworker received a note from the worker. He had come in to see Jay, but 2 hours earlier than her shift began. He took one of the general manager's business cards, leaving a note on it for Jay, saying that he needed to leave early. He said he was returning to his home in Pennsylvania and that he was sorry he had missed her. He left an email for her to get in contact with him. He and his crew had been checked out of the hotel for a week now, choosing to stay in an Airbnb. That same night, or the night after, I can't quite remember, I clocked into work and went to talk to Jay about the events that happened in her shift and asked her to tell me anything in particular that happened that I needed to know about. "Good evening, my dear," I called the front desk as I hurried to clock in. I saw her wave as she checked in a guest, but I could tell from the look on her face that something weird had happened during her shift. I walked into the back office that connected to the front desk and sat down, waiting for her to finish checking the guest in and setting up my iPad to start playing a podcast. As I was pulling up Spotify, Jay walked in and sat on the stool in front of me. You aren't going to believe what happened. What he did. Oh? I thought at first that he had done something sweet like bring her flowers or buy her a ticket out of here like they had been talking about. He killed 3 of his coworkers at that place they were staying at. I remember my stomach just dropping. I felt like I wanted to pass out, and I couldn't even imagine how she was feeling. She had worked all day with the knowledge that the man she had started dating killed 3 of his coworkers. Men that, while rambunctious after work, were still good men and did not deserve to die. Turns out, he had a previous record for assault and was out on bail. His cousin, one of the men he killed, had hired him onto his crew knowing about the prior offense and brought him down to work on a job in a different state. And it all went downhill from there. Jay would email him constantly in jail. She had become pretty much obsessed with the man. It got to the point where every time I would clock in, I would see her reading the same 5 news articles covering the horrible crime he'd committed. The news articles revealed that the whole reason he was returning home to begin with was because he and his boss had gotten into a scrap. It ended with the worker punching his boss in the face, being fired shortly after and sent back home. He had driven all the way to the hotel to leave the note and then to the airport to go back home. When he got to the airport, he left shortly after. He rented a car, drove across state lines, stopped at a Walmart to buy a baseball bat, and returned to the place they were all staying, knowing that the back door would be unlocked. He went in and beat one of the men to death with a bat and stabbed the other 2. On his way out, he injured another. I'm so very thankful that he's in prison, and because of the state he was in, he's currently facing the death penalty. So, the worker I checked in who turned out to be a violent killer, and to an extent Jay for obsessing with him and emailing him even after he killed 3 men. Let's not meet again. For some background, I'm a 20-year-old female. I matched with this guy on Tinder a while back. His name was Nick, and he seemed pretty cool, so I gave him my Snapchat. We talked a little bit, but it died out quickly. I didn't tell him the exact town I lived in, but the city about 10 minutes away because it's decently sized and has a big population of people, and I figured he wouldn't be able to find me by just knowing that bit of information. A few weeks ago, he started messaging me and we made small talk. Everything seemed normal for a while up until New Year's Eve. The day before, he messaged me saying he was going to be in the area, the city I told him I was from, and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch. I told him possibly and I would let him know. The next night, I had a New Year's Eve party with a small group of my friends. I spent most of the day getting ready and was not looking at my phone. Around 7:30, I finally looked at Snapchat and saw that Nick had not only messaged me but also called me. The message read, "Hey, I'm in insert name a city." I responded by telling him I was sorry I just saw his message. He opened it within minutes and totally freaked out. He said something along the lines of, "Just to let you know, I'm really not interested in someone who can't even answer the phone when I drove 6 hours just to see her." I looked at it in disbelief, and for a second I thought he was joking. I responded by asking him what he was talking about and that he didn't drive 6 hours just to see me. He said that we had plans, and why else would he have driven up here? I was confused because we never had plans. He told me that he was going to be in the area, which made me think that he was here for work or to visit a friend. It's not uncommon for people to travel for work here. I explained this to him and told him we did not have plans and that I didn't ask him to drive all that way for me. He told me he sat around for 2 hours waiting for me and even brought me flowers. Again, I was confused because we never planned a time or place to meet and had never confirmed plans. You don't make plans by just telling someone you're going to be in the area. I apologized, but told him again that we never had plans. He told me to make it up to him, that I had to drive up and see him tomorrow. Yeah, not happening. I remember that I had my location shared on Snapchat, so he easily could have shown up at my house. I turned off my location, but kept him on Snapchat just in case he tries to show up at my house. Luckily, I've not heard from him since. This happened back in 2015, and at the time I was 21. Every morning I would wake up early to go for a run. I had developed a routine that was a giant loop. One side of this loop was up the main street of the small Utah town that I was living in at the time. My twin brother would go running at the same time I did, but he would run the loop in the opposite direction that I did. One morning I was running down the main street and was passing this apartment building. In front of the building was a cluster of trees. My view of the tree cluster and the building was obscured by a tall hedge, so I couldn't really see them until I was right in front of the building and past the tall hedge. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a woman standing among the trees and staring at me. A chill runs up my back as I keep my eyes forward as I don't want to be rude and look back at her. It feels as if she is following me as I run past. I keep on running and this creepy encounter slips from my mind. I pass my twin about 2 miles later and finish my run. I get home and my twin isn't back yet, which I find strange because he normally beats me back since he is in better shape than I was at that time. He shows up an hour later and tells me what happened to him. Since the direction he was running in doesn't have a giant hedge to obscure his view, he sees the woman among the trees. Only she wasn't standing like I perceived. She is hanging by her neck. As my twin gets closer to the trees and realizes what he's seen, a man comes running out of one of the apartments, wailing. He picks her up and sets her on the ground and lets out wails of mourning. My twin calls the police and stays to give a report. Although I didn't realize what I'd seen out of the corner of my eye that morning until my twin told me, I think back on that and a chill still runs up my back as I remember the stare I saw out of the corner of my eye from a woman who was not alive. I live alone in an apartment in Utah. My area is fairly metropolitan and it's not uncommon to see unhoused people near my building. Since I'm a single woman, about 20 years old, I'm usually more cautious about locking doors and setting alarms than my friends with roommates. I have a Simply Safe alarm system and also 2 deadbolt locks on my door. Because my area has lots of break-ins, I'm also sure to always lock everything no matter what. 2 nights ago, I came home late from a night out with friends, but I was sober. I made sure to lock everything and set alarms like usual. When I woke up the next morning, I heard somebody in the house. They were wearing shoes and just walking around. One of my friends has the code to my alarm, but none of my friends have a key. I am the only person I know of with the key to the second deadbolt on my door, not even my landlord. I lean my head out the door of my bedroom, which is just a few feet from the more open living room kitchen area where the sound was coming from. There was a man in my kitchen. He was about 6 feet tall and maybe 40 years old. He was wearing a full suit and tie, but seemed really tired or drunk. He was standing by my fridge eating leftovers out of Tupperware and just kind of staring. I ducked back into my room and called 911. For the next 10 minutes, I stood by my bedroom door and listened to this man eat a bunch of food from my fridge. When he was done with something, he would just drop the container to the floor. When the police showed up, both deadbolts were still locked. They knocked on the door and the man in my apartment answered. The police rushed him and yelled if I was okay. When I came out of the bedroom, they had the man pinned to the floor and I saw that he had rearranged the furniture in my living room. There were containers all over my floor. The man wasn't saying anything, and he never said anything even when the police were asking him questions. After they took him away, the officer told me that the man had business cards in his wallet and he works at a bank downtown. The weirdest thing is that my alarm was set and my deadbolts were locked from the inside, even when he was in my apartment. None of the windows were unlocked, and I'm on the 4th floor, or open either. I have no idea how he got in. Update. I apologize for the delay in reporting back. I've been in a back and forth correspondence with the lead investigator, and we were finally able to talk Thursday about exactly what happened concerning the man who broke in, who I'll call Jake for the sake of clarity. On Tuesday of this week, the lead investigator of my case, Nelson, emailed me with this message, among other things. Don't let anybody wearing a hard hat into your apartment. I called him and asked if I could meet with him. He said that he was busy with several cases and could only be able to meet on Thursday of this past week. We emailed back and forth late into Tuesday night and into Wednesday. I would email him back immediately, but it would sometimes take a few hours for him to respond. In one of his follow-up emails, he told me the man who had gotten into my house never worked at the bank in town, and they had tracked the business cards to another person entirely. Additionally, the man who broke into my house is unable to speak. On Wednesday night, all the tenants in my building received a message that light construction work would be ongoing for the next few days to repair wiring and plumbing. I told my landlord in a message back that an investigator into my case has requested for me to deny access to any person wearing a hard hat into my apartment. My landlord told me that there would be no reason for the construction crew to enter my apartment, as all the work that they were doing was in community access breaker boxes and the basement beneath the building. A few hours later, I got a knock on my front door. It was around 10:15 p.m. When I looked through the peephole, there was a man in a denim jumpsuit standing outside my door. He wasn't wearing a hard hat, but he had a tool belt and appeared to be some kind of construction worker. I asked him what he needed, and he said he needed to check the pipes in my bathroom. I asked him why he needed to be doing that at 10:15 p.m., and he said they were trying to get to all the rooms while the water was already turned off. I asked him if he could contact my landlord on speakerphone, so I knew he was legitimate, and instead of complying, he grew angry and told me he was just doing his job. I told him he wasn't allowed to come into my apartment and I wouldn't be opening it for him. I then stepped back into my bedroom and phoned Nelson, my investigator. He didn't respond, but I left him a message. I then called 911 and informed them of my situation, asking if they could come by and check on the workers. The dispatcher told me she would send somebody to my building. I then called my landlord and told her somebody was trying to get into my apartment in a construction outfit, and she told me they left several hours before. I went back to the door and looked through the peephole, and of course he was gone. When the police showed up about 20 minutes later, they couldn't find the man anywhere in the building. However, in the video of our entrance near the mailboxes, the man was seen entering the building at around 10 p.m. Early the next morning, Thursday, Nelson called me and asked if I could meet him at the police station. When I got there, Nelson walked me back to his office. He had an iPad on his desk and a plastic 3-ring binder like I used to use in school. I kinda hoped for a classic manila folder, but oh well. He opened the binder and flipped through some pages before settling and looking at me. Nelson then told me the man who got into my apartment was named Jake, and that he's unable to speak but fluent in ASL. He can hear perfectly fine, and he typically carries a notebook with him to write in for those who can't sign. Nelson then told me how Jake, Nelson would not give the real name of the man, got into my apartment and what the deal with the construction worker was. Jake went missing in mid-December. He works for the Nevada Department of Transportation. Until December of last year, Jake was a fairly respected family man. In his teens, he had been addicted to drugs, but he had kicked the habit and started working for the DOT. In the next couple of decades, Jake got married, had a child, and lived fairly comfortably. However, he had relapsed in December for unknown reasons, and soon after, he had disappeared. There were videos of him acting strangely at gas stations where he had used his credit card in the days after his disappearance, but then he stopped using his card after that. There's a 2-week period where they're not sure what happened with Jake. The next time Jake showed up, it was in Utah, where I live, and he was cited for a minor vehicle infraction. The next time they saw Jake, it was in my apartment. After they took him to the station, they had a long conversation with him where they would talk, he would write, and they would talk again. Jake failed to make sense to the investigators. He wrote about being hungry and not being able to sleep, and when they asked him how he got into my apartment, he would write about how he didn't need any help. Eventually, Nelson was able to get the story from Jake. During his few weeks in Utah, Jake had started going to the bars and meeting some blue-collar workers in the area. He got onto a road construction job from his past DOT experience and met another drug addict named Patrick, not his real name either. He and Patrick both used hard drugs. Patrick had been known to get into apartments by posing as a construction worker, and he had sold stolen goods from apartments to pay for his habit. The night Jake got into my apartment, he was wearing a suit, and his method of breaking in was to look nice enough for somebody to just let him in through the entrance. After that, he would enter any unlocked apartment, step out of their window, and come in through a neighbor's window. Apparently, one of my windows had a broken latch, and it cannot be properly locked. I also don't have sensors on my windows, so that explains why the alarm never went off. When Jake entered my apartment, he had already been to several other apartments. He was high while he was doing this, and he was hungry from several hours of sneaking around, so he went into my fridge and started eating. As Nelson understands it, Jake became drunk by just going through my fridge and eating and drinking. He also said the original owner of the business card lives in my building, and Jake had stolen the business card from the entrance of the man's apartment. Nelson said Patrick would likely try to hit the same apartment as Jake at some point, so it didn't surprise him that Patrick showed up at my apartment not long after Jake did. Nelson said that he would be contacting me eventually for the trial, and that it might be a good idea to intensify security in my apartment until they catch Patrick. For a bit of context, I'm a single female in my 30s and live alone, apart from my pets. I'm on my own when it comes to my safety, is what I'm trying to say. So this happened last summer. It was around 11 p.m. and I was sitting at my dining table, typing away on my final paper of the semester. Behind me sits my kitchen and a big window that overlooks my backyard. This backyard was surrounded completely by a 6-foot vinyl privacy fence. And inside that fence was a little garden I'd been working hard on. Lots of cute flowers and a little pond. I was proud of it and would leave the blinds open so I could take in all my hard work during the day. I was caught up in my paper that was due by midnight, and since it was late, the dogs were snoozing away nearby. My concentration was broken by a very sudden, very loud, and very deliberate tap, 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 tap behind me. I froze completely, and it dawned on me I'd never closed my blinds. All my interior lights were on, and we know how that works. Whoever was tapping could see me perfectly. Weirdly and inconveniently enough, my dogs who normally bark at the slightest noise were still sound asleep. It took me about 5 minutes to muster up the slightest ounce of courage to turn my head just enough to see the window on my periphery, only to hear a loud crunch and another couple of taps just a little lighter. Nope, no need to look. The last thing I needed was to see a face pressed up against that window. To my left was a door to the carport which led to the backyard. The handle was within arm's reach, and I wouldn't have to look at the window to open it. I called to my dogs, and they jumped up as soon as I turned the knob. I guess the watcher realized what I did. About 30 seconds passed, and I heard a couple of more crunches, then a very loud thud. If you've ever heard a vinyl fence being smacked against, it's a bit distinctive, and I knew they jumped it. My dogs finally went nuts and ran to the window near the thud. Lights off and blinds closed there, thankfully. I caught a quick glimpse of a leg disappearing behind the corner of my neighbor's house. I stayed up until dawn with my metal baseball bat and one of those giant sharp grill forks. With the fence and dogs, I always felt safe. How they got back there so quietly, I'll never know. I lived there my whole life and never had anything like this happen to me. I was pretty shaken. Whoever that was wanted me to know that they were there, and definitely wanted my attention. In July of 2014, I got a job at a meat shop in a grocery store. I had no experience at all, but they hired me because they were desperate for help, and I took it because I was desperate for a job. I didn't care what kind of job I had to work or how hard it was because my wife was pregnant and the baby was due in October. I probably would have never even thought to apply for the meat department, but my sister-in-law worked in the office and told me to apply. The next day I got a call to come in for an interview and a drug test. I did and was hired that day. The person from corporate, we'll call him Carl, started showing me the meat shop and telling me my job duties, etc. While doing so, the meat cutter I've known since high school, who was friends with my older brother, we'll call him Steven, was showing the new manager, Mike. We'll use Mike's real name because I'm leaving a link to the news article which tells his name, and I'm not protecting this creep, how to clean the saw, etc. I started the next day and everything went okay. It was all of us in the shop, including Carl. He was only there to help us out until I got the hang of my job and Mike got the hang of his. Mike said he had experience, which he did work in meat shops before, but he was really awful at his job. His cuts of meat were unidentifiable and he did anything he could to get out early. He didn't get real bad until Carl left after about 2 weeks to take care of other shops. He still popped in every now and then, though, and always checked out the shop on his way home. Anyways, Mike creeped me out just on his looks alone. Also, it didn't help on my first day when it was just me and him near the end of the shift, and to teach me how to put the tenderizer back together after cleaning it, he said, "It's just like putting your wang in something soft, you know?" Like I said, I thought he was creepy, but I was afraid to say anything because I thought everyone liked him and I didn't want to lose my job. A few times I thought I was going to because he messed up something and would blame me. About 2 weeks in, Steven was telling me how much he disliked him when we were on our way up front to clock out, and I was relieved and said, "Oh, thank God. I thought I was the only one who thought he was creepy." Steven then talked about how much Mike sucked at his job, etc., and assured me that him and Carl talk every day and they know I'm not messing up, that it's Mike's doing. A few more weeks pass by, and on days when it's just me and Steven, he fills me in on the stuff Mike did while I was off. The one that freaked Steven out was he said he swore he saw Mike staring at a 12 to 13-year-old girl's bottom as she was walking up the aisle. Anytime he would try to tell someone, they would say he was bullying Mike or misunderstood something, that kind of stuff. A few weeks later, Steven, who lives on a farm, fell off of a barn and split his butt open, and he didn't go to a doctor or anything, he just bandaged it up himself and moved on. He was telling this at work only because he had to go on break and change his bandages. When he came back in the room, Mike asked where he put the discarded bandages, and Steven said, "The bathroom trash," with an eyebrow raised, wondering why it was so important. Mike yelled out, "I want to see," and went through the trash with his bare hands to find the bandages. A few days later, Steven and Mike had to go to a meeting at the store the next town over. They took separate vehicles, of course, but Steven said Mike was following him everywhere. Steven kept taking back roads to try to lose Mike so he could change his bandages, but Mike kept following. Once he lost him, he started changing his bandages, and just then, Mike pulled up beside him with a huge grin and rolled his window down and asked, "What are you doing?" Steven was livid and told Mike, "I'm trying to change my freaking bandages." And I guess started cussing Mike out, and Mike took off. Fast forward about a year later, Mike has been in trouble over and over, and Carl met Mike at the doors before opening and sent him to another store 2 counties away. A place Mike didn't want to go. Me and Steven thinks it's because people knew him there and knew how he was. Mike told tall tales, was a pervert, and was just downright disgusting. Steven became the manager and everything was normal for once, and clean. Carl stopped by the shop one day and informed us that Mike was missing. He went on vacation and never came back. A few days later, Steven texted me on my day off saying, "Look up Mike's name on Google because Carl told him to do the same." And I did. And what it turns out is that Mike was caught traveling across state lines to meet up with a 14-year-old. We don't know if he's still in jail or what, but I hope so. This happened several months ago. At the time, I had recently lost my car due to a motor vehicle accident, so I walked for 30 minutes to the store, thinking I'd be able to beat the sunset back, but I was wrong. By the time I was done picking up my groceries, it was pitch black outside. The thing is, I live in a woodsy area where there are not even many sidewalks, so I didn't think it was safe to walk back. I tried getting my brother and cousin to pick me up and drop me off, but they wouldn't have been able to make it for a while, so instead I decided to get a lift. A photo of a suspicious-looking creepy old man popped up as my driver. I waited at the sidewalk for my ride, and maybe like 10 minutes later the driver arrived. It was a silver Toyota sedan, and the driver was an old man wearing a cap and large framed rectangular glasses. Instantly, something felt off about the man's aura, and I try not to let it bother me too much. After all, my home is literally down the street, I reminded myself. I asked him if I could set my groceries in the trunk of his car, and he nodded. I dropped it without noticing what was in the trunk of his vehicle because where we were stopped, it was pretty dark with no street lamps. I helped myself into the car and told him that I live back there, pointing in the direction from which the vehicle had arrived, and let him know that he was only a 3-minute drive from my home. I saw him nod, or so I thought, and as soon as the light switched to green, he made a right. I thought that he was making the right to turn the vehicle around, but instead, he drove past the main road he was supposed to take to get to my home. I let him know immediately that my home was that way while pointing in the direction, and he acknowledged it but still kept going straight, claiming there was an issue with his GPS, and he started driving us in the complete opposite direction of my home where the roads were completely empty. I suddenly didn't feel safe. I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. And in that moment of panic, I immediately reached for my phone to SOS, assuming the worst, but then I stopped myself and told myself to calm down. Make a U-turn, I tried to tell the driver as calmly as possible. I didn't want him to hear the panic in my voice. He didn't respond. My request to turn around was completely ignored. I couldn't keep calm any longer, so I finally yelled for him to make a right turn and to turn around. He reluctantly complied. And along the way back to the road that took me to my home, it felt like the longest 3 minutes of my life. But just when I thought I'd finally be home safe, the driver then suggested an alternate route even though my home was a simple right and a right via the main road and very, very close by. I immediately felt that something was really, really wrong. He slowed down next to a woodsy, isolated path along the way, asking if I'd ever been that way before and that we could take this route instead. I froze. Again, I went into panic mode, but forced myself to calm down so as not to let it be known that I was suspicious of him. I raised my voice once more, telling him my home was that way while pointing toward the main road, which wasn't very far. He finally obliged after some reluctancy and started driving back toward the main road again. The entire time on the way to my home, my heart was racing and my palms were sweating. We arrived at my complex maybe 5 minutes later, and I spoke to him very nicely so that he doesn't try something funny that would force him to react in such a manner that would put my life in further danger. I told him I'd be tipping him well for such a short drive, which would be $10. I quickly hopped out of the car and jolted to the trunk to retrieve my groceries. As I grabbed my bags, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, because this time the street lamps surrounding my complex illuminated the trunk of his car. I froze as I grabbed my groceries, as in the trunk of his vehicle was a rope and a mallet and a bag filled with some contents. I began trembling from fear. I ran up to my building so fast and checked outside my window as soon as I got up to my apartment to make sure he wasn't still lurking and watching. But thankfully, I never had to hear or see from this old man again. My guess was that he had some evil, twisted intentions from which I miraculously escaped because, for whatever reason, he decided to change his mind about those intentions he had for me that night. To this day, I can only guess as to what his intentions were, but judging by the items I found in the trunk of his vehicle, it's not something I would have ever had wished to find out. I was so glad I trusted my instincts that day. So I've worked in a couple hotels in the past, mainly at the front desk dealing directly with the guests. I must say I loved working the graveyard shifts. You never know what kind of interesting situations you might encounter. It always seemed fun, especially on holidays. That day we were full. No more check-ins for me, so it was going to be a light night. I always had an accountant and a security guard in the lobby during my shift, but since it was a calm night, the accountant went to find a place to nap after he was done, and I honestly didn't know where the guard was. I thought since there was no more check-ins, I should be fine. I was going through the log from the last shift and I found a sticky note with my name, and it also said, "Beware 305. No details or anything. I was looking at the monitor with the cameras and clicked on the screen that showed the hallway where room 305 was. Left it there while I finished my work. At around 3 a.m., I was still alone, and from the corner of my eye I saw movement on the monitor. It was a guy. He seemed pretty regular, not creepy at all. He got closer to the front desk and requested his room to be cleaned. We didn't offer 24/7 housekeeping, so I informed him that. "Well, then you come clean. I sleep all day and want my cleaning done during the night." I told him very politely that I couldn't do that, and before I could keep explaining, he asked for my zodiac sign. I answered, a bit confused. All of a sudden, he changes the subject, now talking about how he was a warrior in one of his past lives and that, in this life, he comes from a long line of warriors. He kept changing subjects every 2 minutes and I couldn't keep up. Suddenly, "So, should we start heading up to my room?" Again, I explained. He started getting this weird look on his face, like frustration. He just turned around and walked up to his room. 20 minutes later, I saw him on the monitor coming down again. This time, he took the stairs and stopped before turning to the lobby. He was standing there watching me through a pillar. I was standing in front of the monitors, so it may have looked like I was just working. He then started looking around, almost like checking if there was any other way to get closer without me knowing. I started to get a bit freaked out. It literally looked like he was stalking me. He went up one flight of stairs, then got into the elevator down to the lobby. I imagine he didn't know I had access to the cameras. He came closer to the front desk and requested a tray with water, teas, and milk. I called the kitchen to place the order and let him know that it would be taken up. He asked again what time I was going to clean, and I just told him 7 a.m. when housekeeping arrives. I started trying to locate the guard. At this point, I was getting concerned for my own safety. This guy was starting to act a bit erratic. Before he turns to leave, he gave me an expecting look, opening his eyes wide. "I have like 20 types of drugs in my system right now. That's why I'm awake and sleep all day. My body's going 1,000 miles per hour right now." I didn't know how to answer, honestly, so I asked if he needed medical assistance. He laughed and asked if I wanted to join him for tea. I declined. He left for his room once again. After room service delivered his tea, the waiter went by the front desk. "Hey, so we need security to be here with you. The guy from 305 just asked me if he could use our stairs to get to the front desk without being seen. But first, he offered me money to convince you to go to his room." I was freaked out for sure, but since another person knew of the situation, it gave me a sense of safety, I guess. The waiter left me to try and look for the security guard. At 5 a.m., the guest comes out of his room again. This time, he headed for the maintenance stairs. I didn't have access to the cameras there, but I knew he couldn't get close to me without me seeing him, so I didn't feel in any danger, really. The waiter showed up and told me that one of the security guards caught the guest trying to get to the front desk. The guest kept repeating that it was my idea, that I had been trying to go to his room all night, and that I told him to go through those stairs. The guard made a report about the incident and added what the guest said about me, so it became a bit of a big deal with upper management because it was made to look like the guest was right. Turned out, while they were investigating the situation, some of the female staff claimed he tried to get them to his room under any pretext, but since the attempts were really obvious and he seemed out of it, they would just go in a group or send a male coworker. We've had creeps in the past, but this guy took the prize. The guard that was supposed to be with me fell asleep in the bathroom and was suspended after that. The accountant was reprimanded for leaving me alone also, and they were horrible to work with after that because they claimed it was my fault. Management tended to always be on the guest's side for any type of situation, so no one thought of reporting this guest. They would have fired me for what he said had it not been for the waiter speaking up. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, sometimes it's good to be salty.